In 1969, the fate of Apollo 11's crew depended on a computer with just 72 kilobytes of memory, roughly the capacity of a pocket calculator built from hand-woven rope memory and running at a fragile 1.024 megahertz. Yet this primitive machine was entrusted to steer Eagle's violent 12,000 miles per hour descent, controlling every thruster and calculation with no margin for error. Few people realize how close this hardware, a technological featherweight, came to collapse when a surge of rogue radar data nearly pushed it beyond the brink. If even a single routine failed, the world's first moon landing would have ended in catastrophe. How did such modest circuitry survive what should have been a fatal overload? The answer redefines the meaning of courage and ingenuity at the edge of space. The Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC, was a paradox in metal and wire, simultaneously the most advanced and the most limited computer ever built for flight. Its memory, split evenly between 36 kilobytes of erasable RAM and 36 kilobytes of permanent ROM, barely rivaled a child's digital watch. Yet this was the brain that would steer a spacecraft through the most dangerous descent in human history. Every bit of code and every calculation had to fit within those strict confines. There was no room for excess, no margin for inefficiency. At its core, the AGC ran at a clock speed of 1.024 megahertz, a heartbeat so slow by modern standards that even a basic kitchen appliance today would outpace it. The computer's logic was built from thousands of discrete integrated circuits, each soldered by hand. But its true marvel lay in how it stored its instructions. Instead of silicon chips, the permanent memory of the AGC relied on so-called core rope memory. Here, the ones and zeros of the flight software were physically woven by hand, mostly by women at Raytheon, who threaded copper wires through or around tiny magnetic cores. Passing a wire through a core encoded a 1, bypassing it meant a 0. The process was painstaking. Each rope memory module took weeks to assemble and could not be altered once completed. This was memory as artifact, as much crafted as engineered. The finished modules were robust enough to survive launch vibrations and the vacuum of space, but inflexible. Every command hardwired, every contingency planned in advance. The AGC was often dismissed as a mere calculator, its display and keyboard interface, the DSKY, looking little different from the adding machines of the era. But inside, it was a machine built for survival, forced to make life or death decisions with almost no resources to spare. In the next moments, as the lunar module Eagle began its powered descent, these physical limits would define what the computer could handle and what might push it past the brink. At the heart of the lunar module, the AGC's only window to the astronauts was a device called the DSKY, the Display and Keyboard Unit. This unassuming panel, set with a grid of round mechanical buttons and a glowing numerical display, looked closer to a cash register than to the cockpit of a spaceship. Every command, every emergency, every data request passed through this slab of 1960s engineering. Astronauts would punch in sequences like verb 16, noun 65 to ask for their velocity or position, watching the numbers flicker in response. It was direct, cryptic, and utterly unforgiving. Yet this was the control center for a vessel barreling toward the moon at nearly 12,000 miles per hour. The DSKY was the only way to talk to the computer, and the computer was the only thing keeping the descent stable. Each keystroke had to be precise. There was no error correction, no safety net. Enter the wrong verb-noun pair, and the AGC might simply ignore you, or worse, misinterpret the request at a time when every second counted. The stakes could not have been higher. The lunar module's thrusters fired in short, carefully timed bursts, each one calculated by the AGC, based on a torrent of sensor data and navigation routines. The computer tracked altitude, velocity, and attitude, constantly updating its guidance equations as the surface rushed closer. If the AGC lost its grip, even for a moment, the module could tumble or crash, leaving no time for human recovery. The astronauts depended on the DSKY to relay critical information, fuel status, descent rate, alarms, while they worked through a checklist with no margin for delay. Beneath the surface, the AGC juggled dozens of tasks, prioritizing navigation and control above all else. But the system was already running near its physical limits. The next command, the next sensor update, could push it over the edge. As the lunar surface loomed, the interface that once seemed like a simple calculator became the last line of defense between the crew and disaster. At mission elapsed time 102 hours, 40 minutes, and 30 seconds. The first warning flashed across the DSKY. The code was simple, 1202, but its meaning was anything but. In the cramped cockpit of the lunar module Eagle, 33,000 feet above the moon, Buzz Aldrin read the display aloud, saying 1202 program alarm. The message cut through the static of descent, carrying a weight every engineer at MIT and NASA recognized instantly. A 1202 alarm meant the Apollo guidance computer, the AGC, was overwhelmed. The AGC, with its 72 kilobytes of memory and a clock speed of just over 1 megahertz, was suddenly asked to do more than it could handle. The rendezvous radar, left active as a backup for an abort scenario, began flooding the computer with a torrent of meaningless data. Each burst of garbage information stole precious cycles, pushing the system to its limit. Inside the AGC, the executive software, built on Margaret Hamilton's priority scheduling, fought to keep the most critical tasks alive. Guidance and control routines clung to the top of the list. Everything else was at risk of being dropped. Unlike a modern computer, which might simply freeze or crash under this kind of overload, the AGC's design allowed it to shed low-priority jobs, recover in milliseconds, and keep the spacecraft steady. But to the crew and mission control, the meaning of the alarm was clear. The computer was in trouble. The clock was ticking, altitude was falling, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Each time the 1202 flashed, it was a signal that the line between a safe landing and mission abort had narrowed to a single decision. The next few moments would decide whether humans would set foot on the moon or come home with only stories of how close they came. The overload that threatened to bring down the Apollo 11 landing did not come from a software bug or a failing chip. It began with a single switch. The rendezvous radar, left in auto as a backup for abort, began to feed the AGC a relentless stream of bogus data. This was not a malfunction in the radar itself, but a side effect of how its analog signals were wired into the computer. The radar's coupling data units, driven by their own 800 Hz power supply, slipped out of phase with the control assembly's reference. The result was a perfect storm. False resolver signals pulsed through the system, tricking the AGC into believing the antenna was slewing wildly, even though it was motionless. Each of these phantom movements triggered an interrupt, a demand for the AGC's attention. Instead of the normal background hum of navigation and control, the computer was now being bombarded with up to 12,800 interrupts per second. The load meter, which usually hovered near 85%, shot up past 115%. The AGC was designed for precision, not chaos. Every spurious pulse forced the executive software to drop what it was doing and process useless radar updates, stealing cycles from the real work of keeping the lunar module stable. The checklist had called for the radar to be left on, just in case the astronauts needed to abort and rejoin the command module. But in auto, the hardware fed garbage directly into the computer's most precious resource, its time. The AGC's limited memory and slow clock speed became a bottleneck as the system struggled to keep up with the avalanche of interrupts. This was not the failure of a single component, but the collision of hardware design, operational procedure, and the brutal math of a computer pushed beyond its limits. With the surface rushing closer, the AGC's executive was forced to make hard choices about which tasks would live and which would be abandoned. Margaret Hamilton's name is woven into the very memory of the Apollo guidance computer. At MIT's instrumentation lab, she led the team tasked with a question that haunted every engineer on the project: what happens when the computer is pushed past its limit? In an era when computers simply froze or crashed under overload, Hamilton insisted on something different. She designed the AGC's executive software with fault tolerance at its core, building a system that could not only recognize when it was overwhelmed, but also recover instantly and automatically. The key was priority scheduling. The AGC divided its work into jobs, some essential like guidance and navigation, others expendable like updating displays or processing non-critical sensor data. Each job required a chunk of memory called a core set, a 256-word block carved from the AGC's tiny 36 kilobytes of erasable RAM. When the computer's resources ran low, the executive would scan for the lowest priority jobs and drop them without hesitation. In the language of the AGC, this was called a bailout, a software restart that purged the unnecessary, preserved the vital, and kept the spacecraft on course. Hamilton's architecture treated overloads not as catastrophic failures, but as expected events. The system was built to shed ballast and keep the landing program alive, even as the rest of the computer staggered under the weight of garbage data. No modern blue screen, no frozen display, just a rapid, almost invisible recovery. The guidance loops, protected by periodic state saving called waypoints, would pick up where they left off, missing only a fraction of a second. The AGC's executive did not just run programs, it triaged them, ensuring that even in chaos, the lunar module would not lose its grip on the moon's surface. This was not luck. It was deliberate design, a safety net crafted by Hamilton and her team years before the first 1202 alarm ever flashed. In the next moments, as the AGC fought to stay afloat, that safety net would prove its worth. Milliseconds after each 1202 alarm, the AGC did something no other machine of its era could manage. It shed the overload like a snake losing its skin. The executive software, built on Margaret Hamilton's priority scheduling, instantly identified the flood of useless radar data and purged the lowest priority jobs, radar chores, display updates, anything non-essential. Guidance and control routines, the lifeblood of the descent, remained untouched. This was not a full reboot. There was no loss of navigation, no flicker in the DSKY's critical numbers. The AGC's restart happened so fast, within tens of milliseconds, that the astronauts never lost control. The guidance loops, protected by periodic state-saving waypoints, picked up without missing more than a single heartbeat. The computer's core sets, those 256-word memory blocks carved from just 36 kilobytes of erasable RAM, were cleared and reassigned in a blink. Hamilton later described this as the software not just reporting a problem, but compensating for it. The 1202 alarm was a warning, not a death sentence. In her words, the AGC was informing everyone that there was a hardware-related problem, but that the software was compensating for it. Each alarm meant the computer had just survived another wave of overload, discarded the non-essentials, and kept the landing program on track. Modern computers might freeze or crash in the face of such chaos. The AGC, with its primitive architecture and calculator-like interface, simply kept going. Every millisecond of recovery was a silent argument for robust design, a safety net woven into the very memory of the machine. As the Eagle dropped toward the surface, the software's invisible defense bought time for the humans to decide what came next. 30,000 feet above the moon, the DSKY flashes another 1202 alarm. Buzz Aldrin calls it out, voice steady but urgent. In Houston, Steve Bales, just 24 years old, locks eyes with the code. He knows the numbers, he knows what they mean, but the final call is his. The room is silent, except for the hum of consoles and the clipped chatter of the flight loop. Seconds are slipping away. Each alarm means the AGC is overloaded, but the guidance data remains rock solid. The pattern is intermittent, not continuous, a detail that matters more than anything else right now. A few rows behind Bales, Jack Garman rifles through a stack of simulation notes, his memory racing back to the weeks of integrated mission sequence runs. In those practice sessions, the 1202 had appeared before, always recoverable. Garman whispers the verdict: as long as the alarm is not constant, the computer is shedding ballast, not losing its grip. Bales has trained for this. He remembers the checklist: intermittent 1202, critical tasks preserved, landing can continue. But the margin is razor thin. If the alarm becomes steady, the descent is lost. Bales turns to Flight Director Gene Kranz. The call must come now. The difference between abort and landing hangs on a judgment made in seconds, built on the memory of simulations and the logic of Hamilton's software. Bales speaks into the loop. "We are go on that alarm." The words cut through the tension, buying the crew another chance at the surface. For a moment, the fate of Apollo 11 rests on a single line, delivered with the calm of someone who has already survived this crisis, at least once in a simulation. Bales's voice cuts through the noise. "We are go on that alarm." In that instant, the decision passes from simulation to reality. The words ripple outward from mission control to the lunar module, carrying the weight of every hour spent drilling on failure modes. Armstrong and Aldrin, still descending at thousands of feet per minute, now have permission to continue, a green light into what engineers call the dead man's zone. This is the final, irreversible phase of the landing. Below about 1,500 feet, there is no safe abort. If something goes wrong now, there is no time to ignite the ascent engine and escape. The lunar module is committed, flying on a trajectory that can only end in touchdown or disaster. The flight rules are clear. Above the dead man's zone, mission control can call for abort, and the crew has a fighting chance to break away. Below it, the decision is locked in. Bales's call is not just a technical verdict, it is a point of no return. The AGC, still flashing intermittent alarms, is holding the line. Its software, shaped by Margaret Hamilton's insistence on resilience, is doing exactly what it was built to do: shedding ballast, keeping the guidance loops alive, and refusing to fail. In Houston, the tension is electric but controlled. Every eye is on the numbers streaming in: altitude, velocity, fuel. The guidance officer's judgment, backed by the memory of simulations and the logic of the executive software, has bought the crew a shot at the surface. The Eagle plunges below the threshold, entering the dead man's zone with no margin for error. The last safeguard is gone. From here, it is the computer, the crew, and the moon. Today, our most advanced systems still hinge on code and judgment, not just hardware. The AGC's 72 kilobytes, threaded by hand and slower than a modern watch, did not fail. It adapted. Mission-critical algorithms and decisive humans turned a calculator's panic into a moon landing. In an era chasing automation, Apollo's lesson holds. Software and people are the real safety net when everything is on the line. Share your take below.